The clock above the pie case read 11:47 when the bell above the door stopped, meaning anything good. Rosie's Corner Diner had been sitting at the intersection of Route 66 and County Road 89 for 51 years. It had survived 3 recessions, 2 flash floods, 1 kitchen fire that took out the back wall and half the walk-in cooler, and more bad news delivered at its tables than any one building should reasonably absorb. The neon sign out front, the one that spelled Rosie's in pink and white with the R flickering on cold nights, had become a landmark of sorts. Truckers knew it. Travelers knew it. The kind of people who drove through the high desert at midnight knew it, which was its own kind of reputation. On this particular Tuesday night in late October, the parking lot held 2 vehicles. A rusted Ford pickup with a cracked taillight registered to a man named Declan Caldwell, and a county sheriff's cruiser that would arrive 14 minutes too late to matter and exactly on time for everything that followed. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed their usual frequency. 3 of the 4 ceiling fixtures were working. The 4th had been flickering since September. Eleanor Hartwell had put in the maintenance request twice and stopped expecting anything to come of it. She was sitting in the corner booth. Not by choice. Declan Caldwell was 25 years old and drunk in the way that young men get drunk when they have run out of every other option. He was tall and athletic and had a face that might have been handsome if there weren't something curdled behind his eyes tonight. He held the scissors loosely the way a person holds something they've picked up without entirely planning to, and he moved around the booth in slow half circles, like a man still deciding what he was doing there. Eleanor Hartwell sat with both hands flat on the Formica tabletop. She was 78 years old. Her hair silver and kept in a neat bun, for every one of the 4,000-plus shifts she had worked in this diner was coming undone. Strands of it lay on the seat beside her on the floor at her feet, catching the fluorescent light in a way that made them look like something spilled and irretrievable. She was counting. Not the seconds, not the men behind Declan. There were 3 of them younger standing near the counter, with the hollow expressions of people who had agreed to something without understanding what they were agreeing to. She wasn't counting any of those things. She was counting what she still had. The diner, the trailer on rented land 2 streets over, the money in the account at First National, 4 decades of tips and double shifts, something just under $11,000 that no longer felt like enough of anything. A cardigan with a loose button she'd been meaning to fix. A paperback on her nightstand with 40 pages left. A letter she had read so many times the paper had gone soft as cloth. And a phone recording everything in her apron pocket, which she had started 14 minutes ago. Ruthie Voss, 55 years old. The other half of Rosie's 2-woman evening crew was pressed against the far wall beside the coffee station. Her phone was already in her hand. She had already sent the message. She didn't know if it was going to be enough. "One more snip, old woman," Declan said. His voice carried the thickness of a man who'd had enough bourbon to get brave and not enough to get clear-headed. "Maybe then you'll understand what happens when you make me look weak." Eleanor did not look at him. She looked at the window, at the dark parking lot beyond it, at the way the neon sign threw pink light across the asphalt in long, uneven pools. She was looking for something she'd stopped letting herself believe would come. Then she heard it. Low and distant at first, the way thunder sounds when it's still on the other side of the mountains. A sound that built not in a single note, but in layers, engine over engine. 7 distinct mechanical heartbeats rolling out of the desert night and into the parking lot of a diner on Route 66. Harley-Davidson engines. 7 of them. Declan's hand stopped moving. The engines cut one by one in no particular order, and what replaced them was the specific silence of a parking lot full of men who aren't in a hurry. Boot heels on asphalt. Slow. Deliberate. The sound of men who have walked through harder places than this and have nothing left to prove about it. The door opened. And Eleanor Hartwell, who had spent 40 years watching people come through that door and reading them in the first 3 seconds, looked at the man who stepped through first and felt something shift in the air of the diner. Not relief, recognition. She had seen that Harley before. Freeze. To understand why Eleanor Hartwell did not scream that night, why she sat with her hands on the table and her eyes dry and her breathing measured, while a drunk young man circled her with scissors. You need to understand something about the kind of strength that doesn't look like strength from the outside. It doesn't come from never being broken. It comes from being broken so many times that the breaks have become load-bearing. The cracks filled in with something harder than what was there before. The way scar tissue is denser than skin, the way a bone that heals properly is stronger at the break than anywhere else. Eleanor Hartwell had been building herself back up for a very long time. You have to start in 1984 because that's where Rosie's begins. She was 38 years old when she took the job, which means she'd had a whole first life before the diner, and that first life had not been gentle. Robert Hartwell came home from his second tour with something packed behind his eyes that no doctor had a name for, and no VA program had a treatment for it all. He was a good man. That matters, and it needs to be said plainly. He was a genuinely good man who came home carrying something that wasn't his fault and couldn't figure out how to put it down, and the bottle was the only thing that made it quiet. And he chose the bottle, and choosing the bottle meant Eleanor had to choose something else. She chose the diner. She chose the 6 a.m. shift and the coffee that had to be started at 5:30, and the regulars who came in before sunrise with their work gloves already on and wanted their eggs the same way they'd wanted them for 20 years. She chose the sound of the grill and the smell of bacon and the satisfaction of a counter wiped clean. She chose every morning for 40 years to show up. What she built at Rosie's was not small. Old Walt Pruitt drove up from Sedona on the third Thursday of every month, for her green chili scramble had done it since 1991, and she had known for 15 years that he made the drive because his late wife had ordered the same dish on their first date at a diner that no longer existed. She never mentioned it. She just made sure it was right. The Flores family, the parents, then their children, then their grandchildren, had been coming in for the Saturday breakfast since Reagan was in office, and Eleanor knew which grandchild was lactose intolerant, which one didn't like crusts, which one would steal a sugar packet if you didn't watch the caddy. She knew the highway patrol officers who work nights. She knew what they needed when they came in at 2 in the morning after something bad had happened out on the road, which was usually not food but company and silence, and the feeling that someone knew they were there. She read people, had always been able to do it. Not a gift exactly, more a discipline, the way a good mechanic learns to hear what an engine is telling him before it fails. She could tell you inside 3 minutes whether the couple in booth 4 were celebrating something or surviving something, whether the man at the counter was waiting for good news or bracing for bad. In 1998, she'd talked a young man through something she wasn't going to name in a diner, sat with him for 2 hours and kept refilling his coffee and hadn't asked him anything he couldn't answer. She'd called someone who knew his family without making it feel like a betrayal. Years later, he'd come back with his own kid and pointed at Eleanor and said, "That's the lady I told you about," and hadn't been able to say anything else after that. She did not think of herself as exceptional. She thought of herself as someone who paid attention in a world that had largely stopped doing that. The diner was also where she was when the letter came from the Department of the Army in February of 1991 telling her that her brother Sergeant Arlo James Reeves had been killed in action during Operation Desert Storm in Kuwait and that he had died in service to his country and that they were sorry for her loss. She read it at the counter during the lunch rush because the envelope had the government seal on it and she'd felt her legs go strange and needed something solid to hold on to. She read it again in the walk-in cooler because she needed somewhere to cry that no one would see. Arlo had been older than her by 4 years. Big brother in the truest sense of the phrase, not just by birth order, but by nature, the kind of person who took up space in a room in a way that felt safe rather than threatening. He'd called her Ellie since she was old enough to object to it, and she had never actually made him stop. He'd gone into the Marines at 22 and stayed in because he was good at it, and because he believed in the thing he was doing, and he'd written her letters from every posting, long, careful letters that told her everything about the men he served with, and very little about the danger, which was its own kind of honesty. His last letter was dated 3 days before he died. She still had it, 40 years in the diner. 2 pairs of shoes per year minimum worn through at the heel before she replaced them. A back that started talking to her around year 20 and never really stopped. Hands bearing the weathering of someone who has spent 4 decades in contact with hot plates and coffee urns and industrial cleaning solution. And a small wooden box in her nightstand drawer where she kept Arlo's letters in order, the last one on top, so worn from reading that the paper had become something closer to fabric than paper. She had been waiting for someone. She had stopped admitting that even to herself sometime around her 60th birthday. But in the way that certain habits outlast their justification, she'd never quite stopped doing the waiting. Every night before she turned off the diner lights, she'd look out at the parking lot for a moment that lasted slightly too long. She knew what she was looking for. In September of 2024, 3 weeks before Declan Caldwell walked into her diner, Eleanor had woken at 2 in the morning to the low idle of a motorcycle engine in the trailer park where she lived. She'd parted the curtain, a black Harley engine barely running, the rider sitting still in the way that wasn't random. Not a kid joyriding, Not someone lost, someone who was exactly where they meant to be. She called the county non-emergency line. By the time the deputy arrived, the Harley was gone. She'd told herself it was nothing. She told herself this twice, and the second time was quieter than the first. 3 weeks later, that same Harley was in the diner parking lot with 6 others. And the man stepping through the door at 11:47 p.m. was the man who had been sitting on it. His name was Colt Briggs. He was 62 years old and carried that age the way men carry it when they've spent those years in places that had no patience for softness. 6'2" broad through the shoulders, moving with the economy of someone who has been in enough bad situations to understand that wasted motion is its own form of risk. The scar running from below his left collarbone up to his jaw was old, not fresh violence, but survived violence, the kind that had become part of his face rather than a disruption to it. He wore jeans and boots and a black t-shirt under the leather cut with the Hells Angels three-piece patch Arizona chapter. He swept the room the way she'd watched highway patrol officers sweep a room, automatic, thorough, cataloging everything in seconds. The scattered hair on the seat beside her. The 3 young men near the counter who'd found their feet again and were beginning to edge toward the exit. Ruthie against the wall, phone in hand. Declan's scissors still loose in his grip, turning now to face whoever had come through his door. Behind Colt came Rex Donovan, 68 years old, gray, beard braided down his chest, the posture of a man who has commanded rooms considerably more dangerous than this one. Then Hatch, Dex Webb, and 2 others, 7 men who had earned what they wore. When Colt spoke, his voice was low and even. Not gentle exactly, but reliable. "Boys," he said, "I think you're somewhere you didn't mean to end up." Declan turned, tried to manufacture courage from whatever was left in the bottle. "Old man, get your people out of my business. We're not a gang," Colt said. "Just men, and you just put your hands on a woman who's under our watch." What happened over the next several minutes, what Declan said, what the 3 young men behind him did, what Colt did and didn't do, all of that comes later. What matters now is the moment when Eleanor Hartwell's eyes met Colt Briggs's across the worn linoleum floor of her diner. He was looking at a woman he had been searching for across 2 decades of wrong addresses and dead ends. She was looking at a man she had decided somewhere around 50 to stop believing would arrive. Neither of them looked away. He had her brother's eyes. Not the color Arlo's had been blue, and these were dark brown and deep in a way that said they'd witnessed more than they'd wanted to. But the thing behind the color was the same. The quality that looks out from behind a face when someone has watched people die and decided for reasons they can't fully articulate to keep going anyway. The nightmares always started the same way. Sand. The smell of diesel and something mineral that had no name in English. The weight of gear and the specific irrelevance of youth in the face of incoming ordnance. Colt Briggs had been 29 years old in Kuwait. Lance Corporal, not yet sergeant, still in the phase of service, where a young man believes in his own invulnerability, the particular delusion that combat requires and eventually corrects. Arlo Reeves had been the correction. They were pinned down behind the hulk of a burned-out T-72 tank on the afternoon of February 27th, taking fire from 2 directions. When Arlo saw the RPG trajectory, before Colt had registered, there was something incoming at all. Half a second between Arlo's voice "get down" and the impact. Arlo put his body between Colt and the blast. The physics of it were simple. The physics of it changed everything. The shrapnel caught Arlo in the neck and chest. Colt held him for 7 minutes. 7 minutes is not a long time to do most things. It is a very long time to hold someone while they die. Arlo didn't spend those 7 minutes on himself. Not on the pain, not on fear, not on what he was doing or asking for recognition of it. He spent them on his sister, Eleanor. He called her Ellie. "She's going to be alone, Colt. Our parents are gone. Her husband came back. Wrong, you understand. He's going to need her and take it out on her, and she'll stay because that's who she is. You find her. You protect her. Do what I can't do anymore." The word promise hadn't passed between them. It hadn't needed to. Some agreements are made at a level where words are just noise. Colt had started looking as soon as he was stationary enough to look. He'd had a name, Eleanor Reeves, and a hometown in Arizona, and a VA office that had no useful information, and a social worker who returned his calls exactly once. What he hadn't known was that Eleanor Reeves had become Eleanor Hartwell in 1972. Married young, changed her name entirely, and built a life under a different identity than the one her brother had known to give him. He'd gone looking for a woman who on paper had stopped existing. The years after Kuwait had not been smooth. There was the garage in Flagstaff where he'd worked on engines, because the mechanical certainty of them kept the other parts of his brain occupied. There was the drift toward the Arizona Hells Angels chapter, not the thing the newspapers said it was, but a brotherhood of men who had mostly been through things and decided to stand beside each other rather than alone. There was Caroline, whom he'd met through a mutual friend in Tucson, who had possessed the courage required to love someone still in the process of finding out who he was. There was her death 4 years ago from cancer that moved fast, leaving Colt standing in a house that felt like a stage set with no performance scheduled. There was the wall above his workbench in the garage, where he kept a photograph of Arlo in dress blues, a photograph of Caroline on their wedding day, his purple heart in a shadow box, and a map of Arizona covered in red marks. 217 of them by the final count. Each one a wrong address, each one the particular deflation of a lead that had led nowhere. He'd hired the investigative firm 6 months ago, not because he'd found a new lead, but because he was 62 years old and the arithmetic of things had become impossible to ignore. Jennifer Rodriguez had called on a Thursday morning in September. Colt had been outside the garage, coffee in hand, watching the sun clear the ridge. "Mr. Briggs, I believe we found her." He'd sat there for a long time after he hung up. Eleanor Marie Reeves married Robert Hartwell in 1972. She had changed her last name. She had moved to Flagstaff in 1998 and had not updated her contact information with the Veterans Administration or the Red Cross Emergency Registry or any of the 3 military family support organizations he'd contacted over the years. She had, in the way of people too busy surviving to think about administrative details, made herself invisible to anyone searching for the woman she used to be. Currently employed at Rosie's Corner Diner, Route 66, Flagstaff. She'd been in the same city as him. He didn't know how long enough that he'd probably driven past her diner without stopping. He called Rex that evening and said, "I found her." Rex said, "Come to the chapter house." Colt said, "I need to go alone first." Rex said, "I figured you'd say that." The afternoon he walked into Rosie's for the first time was a Tuesday in mid-September. The lunch rush had thinned. A trucker with a newspaper. An older couple working through a slice of pie, and behind the counter a woman with silver hair and a neat bun and hands that moved with the efficiency of 4 decades of practice. He sat at the counter. "Coffee, please," he said. "Black." She poured it without looking up, set the cup in front of him, started to move away. "Are you Eleanor Reeves?" he asked. Her hand stopped on the counter. She turned slowly. Her face moved through several things at once, arriving and departing too fast to name them individually. "Who's asking?" she said. Colt reached into his breast pocket, slowly showing her the movement. He set Arlo's dog tags on the counter between them. "Kuwait," he said. "February 1991. Arlo was my brother, not by blood, but by every other measure that counts. He saved my life, and the last thing he asked me to do was find you. I've been looking for 33 years. The coffee pot she'd been holding slipped. It hit the tile floor and broke apart, and the coffee spread in a dark stain, and Eleanor Hartwell gripped the edge of the counter with both hands and stood there breathing. "You're lying," she said, but the word had no conviction in it. He wasn't lying, and she knew it immediately because of what he told her next. He told her about the cookies. 6 dozen of them, care package, January of 1991. Arlo had received them and distributed every one to the unit on the day they arrived, eating nothing himself, until the last was gone, and had said her cookies were the best thing that had come from home in 6 months. He said Arlo had kept a photograph of her inside his helmet and looked at it every morning before patrols. He said Arlo had told him in the particular quiet of a man who doesn't exaggerate about the people he loves, that when he got home, he was going to sit at his sister's kitchen table and eat an entire plate of her cookies without stopping. "Stop," Eleanor said. Her voice had broken somewhere in the middle of it. Colt stopped. The tears came then, not as a flood, but as a slow overflow, the release of a container that has been full for so long, it has forgotten what empty feels like. She didn't make a sound. They simply came. "Why now?" she said. "Why 33 years? That was the question he'd rehearsed no good answer for. Because there was no good answer, only the true one. "I looked," he said quietly. "God help me, I looked. 200 cities, every Eleanor Reeves I could find, every wrong address, every dead end. I never stopped looking. I promise you that." She looked at him for a long time. 33 years, she said. Her voice had found its edges. "Do you know what happened in 33 years? My husband came home from his war and drank himself to death trying to forget what he'd seen. I lost our house. I worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. My son made choices I couldn't stop him from making. And you were supposed to be there. Arlo said if anything happened to him, you would be there. Each word carried the weight of decades behind it. Colt didn't flinch. He didn't reach for an explanation. He'd stood in places before where there was no explanation adequate to the damage. This was another one. You're right, he said simply. I failed him. I failed you. And I'll carry that the rest of my life. But I'm here now, and if you'll let you, what she said, ride in and fix everything. I don't need a rescuer. I needed one 33 years ago. What I need right now is for you to leave. She untied her apron and went into the back. Ruthie appeared from the kitchen, took in the scene, the broken coffee pot, the dog tags on the counter, Eleanor's absence. She gave Colt a look that required no translation. He picked up the dog tags, took out his wallet, and left a $20 bill on the counter, more than the coffee, considerably more. He turned it over and wrote his number on the back in the neat, precise hand of a man who'd spent years writing on whatever surface was available. If she needs anything, he said to Ruthie, anything at all. He walked out. His Harley started on the first kick. He sat for a moment with the engine running, looking at the neon sign, then rode out onto Route 66 and let the desert dark close around him. He was 2 miles down the highway when he turned around. He didn't go back inside. He parked across the street behind a closed gas station and sat there in the dark for an hour watching the diner lights. He'd failed Arlo once by being too late. He was not going to do it again. What Colt Briggs didn't know, sitting in the dark across from a diner in Flagstaff, was what Eleanor Hartwell did when she got back to her trailer that night. She went to the nightstand drawer. She took out the wooden box. Inside were 40 years of Arlo's letters in order, oldest at the bottom, the last one on top worn so soft from handling that the folds had become structural to the paper rather than interruptions in it. She opened it and read it the way you read something you know by heart, not for the words, but for the voice behind them. Ellie he had written in the careful block letters he used when he wanted to be sure she understood every word. If something happens to me, I need you to find Colt Briggs. He'll be with the 1st Marines Lima Company. He's the best man I've ever served with, and I've made him promise to look after you. Don't be too proud to let him. You've been taking care of yourself your whole life, and you're better at it than anyone I know, but you don't have to do it alone. Trust him the way you trust me. Look after each other. She folded the letter back along its creases and understood something she had not understood fully until that moment. Colt Briggs had spent 33 years looking for Eleanor Reeves, but Eleanor Reeves had not existed since 1972. She'd become Eleanor Hartwell when she married Robert, and she'd been so deep in the work of surviving what her marriage required that she'd never thought about what it meant to disappear from the name her brother knew her by. When Robert died in 2012 and she'd considered going back to Reeves, it had seemed like too much paperwork, too much explanation. She'd stayed Hartwell because she was tired and there was nobody left to go back to. She had not updated her contact information with the Veterans Administration when she moved from Tucson to Flagstaff in 1998. She had simply moved the way people move when they're carrying too much to also carry administrative details. She had, without knowing it mattered, made herself impossible to find. All 217 of those wrong addresses. All those years. She had been looking at the parking lot every night for 33 years, and she had made herself invisible to the only person looking back. Eleanor sat in the dark of her trailer with her brother's last letter in her hands and felt something she hadn't felt since Arlo's death first arrived, the vertigo of discovering that a story you thought you knew has a different shape than you believed. She did not sleep. At 4:30 in the morning, she got up, put on her uniform, and walked the half-mile to the diner in the dark, breathing sage and cooling asphalt, watching the first stars lose their confidence against the approaching light. She started the coffee at 5. At 5:20, she took the $20 bill Colt had left from the register where Ruthie had put it, and she turned it over and she looked at the number written on the back. She put it in the front pocket of her apron. Not because she'd decided anything, because she hadn't. And not deciding is its own kind of decision, the one you make when you need more time, but the time is already running out. 14 days later, the eviction notice arrived. 3 pages. Standard legal language. The land beneath her trailer, which she had been renting from Edwin Caldwell on a handshake agreement for 25 years, paying it on time every month, never once late now, belonged to Edwin's son. Edwin had died in April. Declan Caldwell had inherited everything. Declan was not interested in handshake agreements. 28 days. She read it twice at the counter, folded it and put it in her apron pocket next to the $20 bill. Then she refilled the coffee for the highway patrol officer at the end of the counter, without him asking because she knew he was going to need it and because some habits of attention survive everything else. Later on her break, she went into the supply closet that served as the diner's only private space, and she sat on the step stool in the dark, and she did not cry, and she did not make a sound. She took out the $20 bill. She looked at the number. She put it back. She had 28 days, and she had $11,000, and she had 40 years of learning to survive things that looked unsurvivable. She took the bill out again. At 5:47 the next morning, sitting on the bench outside the diner door, with the desert sky moving from black to purple above the eastern ridge, Eleanor Hartwell dialed the number on the back of the 20. It rang twice. She heard the line pick up. The specific silence of someone who has answered a call they've been waiting for without wanting to seem like they were waiting. She spoke first. "Colt Briggs," she said. "This is Eleanor Hartwell. I have 28 days and $11,000 in a letter from my brother that says I should trust you. I'm not sure I do yet, but I'm willing to find out if you are." The sound of a Harley engine, just one this time, came out of the early morning from 2 streets over. She did not let herself feel relieved. She did not let herself feel anything yet that she couldn't afford to feel. But she did not look away. The bench outside Rosie's Corner Diner faced east, which meant anyone sitting on it in the early morning had no choice but to watch the sun come up. Eleanor had done it thousands of times over 40 years, usually in her coat coffee in hand, taking 10 minutes before the first customers arrived to sit with the desert in its quietest state. Colt arrived at 5:53. He didn't rush getting off the bike. He killed the engine and sat for a moment, not hesitating, but settling, giving himself one beat to be still before whatever came next. He got up and walked to the bench and sat at the far end of it, leaving the middle empty between them, and he did not look at her immediately. He looked at the highway. She appreciated that. She had the $20 bill in her apron pocket, the eviction notice in the other, and Arlo's last letter underneath both of them in the innermost pocket with the button closure. She took out the eviction notice and held it out to him without preamble. He read it again, folded it along its original creases and held it for a moment before passing it back. 28 days, he said. 28 days and $11,000, she said. 40 years of tips and double shifts and not taking vacations I couldn't afford. I'm not telling you that for sympathy. I'm telling you so you understand what we're working with. Colt nodded in the way of someone who is actually listening. Eleanor reached into the innermost pocket and took out Arlo's letter. She'd thought about this on the walk over in the dark, whether she wanted to do this or whether it was simply the right thing. She had decided she couldn't tell the difference anymore, which meant it was probably both. She held out the letter. He took it carefully the way you handle something that belongs to someone else, unfolded it along the creases that had become its architecture, and read it. She watched him read. His face received rather than performed. The stillness of someone for whom the words on the page had opened a room they hadn't been inside in a long time. His hands were not entirely steady. He didn't appear to notice. He read it twice. Then he folded it back along every crease in sequence until it was the same shape it had come to him in and returned it without speaking. She put it back in the innermost pocket and buttoned it closed. The sun cleared the ridge and the desert went from suggestion to color, the warm light catching everything that had been invisible a moment before. "You've been looking for me for 33 years, Eleanor said. "I've got 28 days. I'd say we're even." It wasn't a joke. She didn't deliver it like one. It was the most accurate accounting she could give of where they stood, which was in a situation that was not fair and not of her making and not going to wait for her feelings about it to resolve. Colt turned to look at her then. "Tell me about the land," he said. So she did. Edwin Caldwell had been the kind of landowner who operated on the handshake economy, going out of style for decades, but which he'd maintained on principle, partly because he'd made more good deals with a handshake than a contract, and partly because he simply trusted Eleanor Hartwell, who had paid her rent on the first of every month for 25 years without once being asked twice. $600 a month below market even 25 years ago never raised. Their agreement renewed verbally every January over coffee at this exact diner, and Eleanor had always ordered him the green chili scramble. Edwin died in April of a stroke. His son Declan had inherited everything. Declan was 25 years old and had grown up largely absent from his father's life, his parents having separated when he was 6. He had arrived at the reading of the will with debts that were not small and plans that were not modest, and he had looked at his inheritance the way a person looks at a pile of lumber when what they need is cash. "There's a developer," she said, "Victor Crane. He's been trying to buy up this stretch of Route 66 for 3 years. The diner property, the land around it, the trailer park. Most people sold. Edwin didn't. And I don't own the land under my trailer. I just rent it, so I couldn't have sold even if I'd wanted to. But as long as Edwin was alive, it didn't matter. And now Declan needs to sell. And I'm the last holdout. He's already reached his deals with 4 other spaces. The remaining 2 are empty. I'm the last one with roots in the ground. She said this without drama because it was the situation, and she had long since stopped having the energy to dramatize situations that were simply the situation. Colt sat quietly for a moment. I want to bring my chapter in on this, he said. Eleanor looked at him sideways. I don't need a cavalry, she said. I know. But you might need lawyers and information and men who know how to find things people are trying to keep hidden. We have all 3. She considered this directly without sentimentality. What do they get out of it, she said. They get to keep a promise, he said. That's what we do. She turned back to the highway. A semi was coming through from the west, its headlights still on in the thin morning light. You've got until the end of my shift to convince Rex Donovan that I'm worth the trouble, she said. Then I'll decide. It was the most she was prepared to offer. It turned out to be enough. Rex Donovan was 68 years old with the gray beard of a man who'd stopped caring about its appearance several decades ago. Former Green Beret, 2 tours in places he did not specify. He ran the Arizona chapter with a combination of strategic patience and absolute clarity about which lines were not to be crossed that had characterized every command he'd ever held. When Eleanor sat down at the chapter table, which she did with the posture of someone who has sat at a great many tables and found most of them lacking, but was willing to withhold final judgment, on this one, Rex looked at her for a moment. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, we don't get into other people's business unless we're asked. Are you asking? Eleanor put both hands flat on the table. I'm asking, she said. That was sufficient. Gordon Hatchett Hatch had spent 12 years doing financial intelligence work for the Army before a knee injury ended his military career. He took Declan Caldwell apart on paper inside 48 hours. Declan owed $200,000 to the Palms Casino in Phoenix. That much was known. What Hatch found underneath it was more complicated. The debt had accumulated over 18 months fast, even for a young man with no filter on his impulse control. Fast enough to suggest some portion of the losing had been structural rather than accidental. He found the loan. Not from the casino, from a private lending entity registered in Delaware with a name that told you nothing in terms that told you everything. $200,000 extended to Declan Caldwell 11 months ago at a rate technically legal in Delaware and criminal in 17 other states. The collateral was the Caldwell land holdings. Buried in Clause 14 was a 90-day mandatory liquidation trigger if Declan had not sold the relevant properties within 90 days of the loan, date the interest restructured at a rate that would reduce him to nothing inside 6 months. The loan had been made 11 months ago. The 90 days had come and gone 8 months ago. Declan Caldwell wasn't choosing to evict Eleanor to pay a debt. He was selling because the alternative was losing everything, including the land itself, to a lender who had structured the deal to ensure that outcome on if the sale didn't happen on schedule. Hatch put this on the table in 4 sentences. Then Dex, quieter than the others, with sources in places that didn't invite questions, put down a single sheet of paper. The private lender in Delaware, he said, is a shell that traces 2 steps back to a holding company Victor Crane uses to acquire properties before his name needs to appear on anything. The table was quiet. Crane arranged the debt, Rex said. Not a question. Crane arranged the debt, Dex confirmed. He found a young man with a gambling problem and an inheritance, put money in his hands on terms designed to fail, and sat back to wait for the foreclosure or the forced sale. Declan is the mechanism, not the decision maker. When Colt relayed this to Eleanor later, she sat with it for a moment. Then the boy needs saving too, she said. Colt looked at her the way you look at someone who has said the thing you least expected. He needs accountability, Rex said carefully. He needs both, Eleanor said. And they're not the same thing. Nobody argued with her. The legal position was not good. No written lease. 25 years of on-time payments was a compelling human story and a weak legal argument. Arizona law was clear on month-to-month tenancy without documentation. Declan had filed the paperwork correctly. The eviction was legitimate on its face. What wasn't legitimate was the engineered debt behind it, and a recorded confession might be a different matter entirely. Eleanor went to see Declan herself first. She had told Colt she was going to do this, not asked whether she should, and he had understood the difference. Declan was living in his father's house on the north side of Flagstaff. He answered the door in sweatpants, and the surprise on his face when he saw her was genuine. She sat at his kitchen table. He sat across from her, She put her $11,000 on the table in a bank envelope and told him what it was and what she was offering: a real written lease, fair terms, 25 more years of what his father had already agreed to with a handshake. He listened. She watched him listening. She could see the moment he was genuinely considering it and the moment something closed behind his eyes. "I can't," he said. "There are things in motion you don't understand. Even if I wanted to." She pushed the envelope an inch closer. "Your father shook my hand every January for 25 years, she said. "I never gave him a reason to regret it. I'm asking you to honor that." Declan looked at the envelope. He looked at it for a long time. He laughed, not a cruel laugh. Worse, the laugh of someone who has found something funny for exactly the wrong reason. The sound of a young man discovering that $11,000 and 33 years of good faith are not sufficient in the geometry of what he'd gotten himself into. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "I'm sorry, I genuinely am. But there's nothing I can do." She took the envelope back, stood, pushed her chair in precisely. "Your father was a man of his word," she said. "You know that. You also know what he'd say about this." She left without waiting for him to answer, because some things land harder in silence. That evening, she told Colt what Declan had said. They sat on the bench outside the diner in the dark without speaking for a while, which had begun to feel less strange than it once had. "Then the boy really is trapped," Eleanor said. "He chose to get into the trap," Colt said. "Most people who get into traps think they're making a choice," she said. "That's the whole design of a trap." Colt had no argument for that. Ruthie Voss had Colt's number because Eleanor had put it in the diner's emergency contacts the morning after their first meeting on the bench. She had not told Colt she'd done this. She had simply done it the way she did things that needed to be done without requiring them to be announced. On a Thursday evening, Webb confirmed that Declan's routine included a stop at a bar on the east side of Flagstaff between 8 and 10. Colt went in at 8:30 with his phone in his chest pocket and the voice memo application running. He sat 2 stools from Declan. They'd met briefly during an earlier property discussion that had gone nowhere, and Declan recognized him. The conversation started sideways, working around the real subject. Colt talked about his father, a man he hadn't known well, and what it felt like to inherit that distance. He watched Declan's shoulders drop by a degree. Then he said, "I knew your father, Edwin. He came into the diner sometimes. He struck me as a man who built his reputation on keeping his word." Declan said nothing. Colt said, "That kind of reputation is worth something." Declan said, "Worth less than a signed contract, apparently." Colt let that sit. "I know about the Delaware loan, Declan," he said. The bar stool shifted. "I know about the 90-day trigger. I know about Crane's holding company. I know that what looks like you choosing to evict an elderly woman is actually Crane using a debt he engineered to get the last piece of land he needs." Declan stared at his drink. "You can't know that," he said. "I do. And in 48 hours, so will a lawyer who specializes in exactly this kind of predatory lending arrangement." A long silence. Then Declan talked. Not cleanly. It came out in pieces in the wrong order, with repetitions that had to be worked through before the actual shape emerged. The loan and its terms. Crane's representative, who had shown up at Declan's door 6 months ago, with a proposition that had seemed at the time like a solution. A deal Declan had made before all this with someone named Leland Hartwell, Eleanor's son apparently, which he had genuinely intended to honor before Crane's people made clear the consequences of honoring it. The eviction notice filed because he saw no other direction. The phone recorded all of it. What Colt hadn't expected was the moment Declan stopped talking about logistics and started talking about his father. "I know what he'd think," Declan said. "Of all of it, I've known this whole time. You get to a point where you've done enough wrong that you can't see the way back to being right. So you just keep going in the direction you're already going because stopping feels worse than continuing." Colt said, "Stopping always feels worse, right up until it doesn't." Declan looked at him. The bourbon and exhaustion and something that might have been relief had stripped his face of its performance. "What do I do?" he said. "You sign a lease," Colt said, "a real one. 10 years fair terms. And then we deal with Crane together." Declan signed 3 days later in the office of a lawyer named Carla Stokes, whom Webb had known for years, who specialized in exactly the kind of predatory arrangements Crane's holding company had constructed. The Delaware loan documentation challenged on grounds solid enough to create meaningful delay. More importantly, the filing put Crane's holding company on record in an Arizona court, making certain things considerably more visible than they'd been. Declan shook hands with Eleanor. He couldn't meet her eyes, but he shook her hand. Eleanor held the contract afterward in both hands, looked at it for a while, then folded it along clean creases and put it in her apron pocket next to the $20 bill she still had not spent. Ruthie had brought a small bottle of sparkling wine to the diner that afternoon, the kind that came in a 4-pack poured into coffee cups because they didn't have the right glasses. She raised hers and said, "To Eleanor Hartwell, who outlasted another one." Colt smiled. It was the first time Eleanor had seen him do it without something heavy behind it. Eleanor raised her coffee cup. She didn't drink from it immediately. She sat with it in her hand and looked out the window at Route 66 in the afternoon light, and she thought about the 10-year lease in her apron pocket, and she thought about Edwin Caldwell shaking her hand every January, and she thought about Victor Crane sitting in an office somewhere with plans that had been inconvenienced, but not stopped. She drank. She walked home that evening in the last of the daylight, the desert going gold around her shoes quiet on the shoulder of the road. She let herself into her trailer and made dinner and washed the dishes and sat at the small table by the window with the lease in front of her and the eviction notice beside it, comparing them the way you compare a wound and a bandage, knowing they are not the same thing. She had a 10-year lease and an opponent who had been redirected, not defeated. She put both documents away and went to bed at 9. She did not sleep particularly well. 3 nights later at 11:32 in the evening, Ruthie's phone rang. Ruthie had been closing the diner dishes done counters wiped register tallied. She answered the call from a number she didn't recognize and heard a young man's voice slurred and urgent and frightened in the way people get frightened when they've done something they don't know how to stop. It was Declan Caldwell. He told her what was happening, what he'd come with, what Crane had told him would happen if the signed lease wasn't reversed, if Eleanor wasn't frightened badly enough to vacate voluntarily. His voice kept breaking and restarting at a different pitch, the voice of someone who'd been told that this was what happened now and had called for reasons he couldn't articulate the place he was about to harm. Ruthie hung up and called Colt. Then she looked at her phone's clock and she walked to the supply closet at the back of the diner, and she stood there in the dark and with her hands on the shelf, steadying herself. She thought about Edwin Caldwell shaking Eleanor's hand. She thought about Declan's face when she'd pushed the envelope across his table. She thought about Victor Crane, whom she had never met, moving people around a map he'd drawn without anyone's permission. She thought about Arlo. She thought about the way his letter ended. "You've been taking care of yourself your whole life, and you're better at it than anyone I know." She took her phone from her apron and opened the voice memo application and hit record and put the phone back in her pocket. Then she walked out of the supply closet, took a booth in the corner, put both hands flat on the table and waited. She counted what she still had. The diner, the lease, Ruthie's call to Colt already sent, the recorded conversation from the bar already in the lawyer's hands, and the phone recording everything in her pocket right now. She had called the sheriff 14 minutes ago. She was ready. The bell above the door rang at 11:47. The engines cut in sequence outside one after another, like a sentence spoken one word at a time. 7 distinct silences. Then boot heels on asphalt. The sound of men moving without urgency through a parking lot toward a door, toward whatever was happening inside. The door opened. Colt Briggs stepped through first. Behind him came Rex Donovan with his braided beard, then Hatch Dex Webb and 2 others. 7 men who had earned what they wore standing in the threshold of a diner on Route 66. Colt's eyes swept the room. Found Eleanor immediately, found the phone in her apron pocket. And she saw the moment he understood, the fraction of a second, when his expression shifted into something adjacent to surprise, the look of a man who had spent 33 years preparing to protect someone and had just discovered she didn't need it in the way he'd imagined. He stopped at the threshold. He didn't come further in. Declan turned to face the men in the doorway, tried to find something to stand on. The 3 young men behind him had stopped moving entirely, recalculating in real time. Eleanor stood up. She did it slowly, planting her feet, straightening her spine, and setting her shoulders the way her mother had taught her before her mother was gone. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall and 78 years old, and she had been standing in this diner since before Declan Caldwell was born. She looked at him. "Declan," she said. Her voice carried the weight of 40 years behind a counter, quiet and level, and containing something that had nothing to do with volume. "I know about Victor Crane," she said. "I know about the Delaware loan and the 90-day trigger and the holding company he used to arrange your debt before his name ever needed to appear on a single piece of paper. I know that you didn't come here because you wanted to. I know that someone made it very clear what would happen if you didn't." She reached into her apron pocket and took out her phone. "I called Sheriff Aldridge 14 minutes before you walked through that door," she said. "And I've been recording since before you sat down." The scissors left Declan's hand. Not thrown, not surrendered formally. They simply left his grip the way things leave hands when the muscles stop believing in what they're holding. They hit the linoleum and the sound they made was smaller than everything that had preceded them and considerably more final. Declan stood in the corner of the diner and looked at the phone in Eleanor Hartwell's hand and at the 7 men in the doorway and at the 3 young men behind him who were already edging for the exits, and what happened to his face was not one thing. It was the collapse of a performance held up for months. The arrival of a consequence he'd known was coming without knowing what shape it would take. And underneath both of those, something she recognized from 40 years of watching people hit the moment when they can no longer carry what they're carrying. She had seen it in her husband's face near the end. She had seen it in her son Leland's face on the last night she'd seen him. She knew what it looked like when a person ran out of road. The 3 young men left one at a time. The youngest stopped at the door, his eyes red, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hartwell. I didn't know it was going to," and then stopped because there was no way to finish that sentence and went out. Colt and the chapter stood where they were. Nobody moved toward Declan. Nobody spoke. They understood with the collective intelligence of men who know when to hold a position that this was Eleanor's. She walked to the booth across from Declan. She sat down. She gestured at the seat across from her. He sat, heavily without grace the way a person sits when their legs have stopped cooperating with the version of events they'd planned. He put his forearms on the table, and his head went forward and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. She let him do that for a moment. Then she said, "Look at me, Declan." He looked up. His face stripped of the performance it had been running on bourbon, and desperation was younger than she'd understood it to be, which was not the same as innocent, but was related to it. "You hurt me tonight," she said. "I want you to understand that before anything else, not just the scissors, the eviction notice, the power being cut twice, the health inspector, all of it. I felt every one of those things." Declan said nothing. The silence had its own texture, the texture of someone absorbing what they're being told, because there is no defense available, and they know it. "Your father shook my hand every January for 25 years, she said. "He never gave me a reason to doubt his word. And you came in here tonight with a pair of scissors and tried to tear that up, because a man you'd never met arranged for you to owe more money than you can pay." "My father," Declan started, "was a man of honor," Eleanor said. "He built something that would have lasted if circumstance hadn't driven you somewhere he couldn't have predicted. Victor Crane found someone who needed money and gave it to him on terms designed to fail. That doesn't excuse what you did tonight, but it explains how you got here, and those are not the same thing. I can't fix this," he said. "I've done too much. There's no way back." "There's always a way back," she said. "It's never the way you came in, but it's there." She heard Colt shift his weight in the doorway. She did not look back at him. "You're going to talk to the sheriff when he gets here," she said. "You're going to tell him the truth about tonight. All of it. And then you're going to talk to Carla Stokes about Victor Crane, because what I have on this phone combined with what Colt's people have already documented is enough to make his life considerably more complicated than it currently is." Declan looked at her. "Why?" he said. "After all of this. Why?" She thought about Edwin Caldwell and his handshakes. She thought about her son, somewhere in a city she didn't know, making choices she couldn't reach. She thought about Arlo, who had spent his last 7 minutes not on himself. "Because your father was a decent man," she said. "And decent men are worth honoring even when the people they leave behind have lost the thread of it. You haven't lost it permanently. You've just gone a long way from where it was." She paused. "And because I've run out of patience for the idea that people can't change, I've watched too many who did and too many who didn't, and the difference was almost ever capability. It was whether someone decided to." Sheriff Wade Aldridge arrived with 2 deputies at 11:59. He took one look at Rosie's Corner Diner, 7 bikers, 2 crying young men outside Eleanor Hartwell, at a counter booth, scissors on the floor, and decided this one required both urgency and patience. He took Eleanor's statement first, listened without interrupting. He took Colt's statement second, shorter, establishing the timeline of arrival and what the chapter had and hadn't done, which was stand in a doorway. Declan was taken into custody without resistance. He went with his head down. Before the deputy guided him out the door, he stopped and turned back. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. She waited. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not sorry I got caught. Sorry I did it. I know the difference." She held his gaze. "I know you are," she said. "Earn the rest." The diner was quiet after the deputies left. Ruthie sat on a stool at the counter with her hands wrapped around an empty coffee cup, not for the coffee, but for something to hold. The chapter had moved outside, not because anyone asked, but because they understood the shape of what the room needed. Colt stood at the end of the counter. He looked at Eleanor. He had the expression of a man trying to find words adequate to something for which adequate words may not exist. She saved him the trouble. "You came," she said. "That's enough." He nodded once. The recording from Eleanor's phone entered into county evidence that night contained 43 minutes of audio. The first 11 minutes captured Declan's voice saying things that constituted evidence of criminal harassment under Arizona statute. The following 32 minutes captured everything that followed. What it also captured in the ninth minute was Declan's voice saying, "Victor Crane told me I had to finish this." His exact words. Crane had a timeline and I was on it. 22 seconds of audio. Those 22 seconds combined with Hatch and Dex's documentation of the Delaware Holding Company and the statement Declan provided during his 6 weeks in county custody were sufficient to open a formal federal investigation into Victor Crane's business practices across 4 states, 17 properties, and a pattern of predatory debt structuring that had been operating below the legal radar for 11 years. The investigation was 3 months underway on the morning Victor Crane walked out of a Phoenix courthouse after an unrelated preliminary hearing and found 2 federal agents waiting on the steps with a warrant. He was 61 years old and had spent his entire career as the name in the subsidiary, the signature on the holding company, the man behind the man. He had been very good at it for a very long time. Eleanor learned about the arrest from Wade Aldridge, who called during the lunch rush, and told her in the flat tone he used for things that were facts and not yet narratives. She listened, thanked him, hung up and finished the table she was serving. Ruthie, who had heard half of it from across the counter, looked at her. "Victor Crane was arrested this morning in Phoenix," Eleanor said. She picked up the coffee pot. "Table 4 needs a refill," she said, and she went to give it to them. That evening she walked home in the dark, the desert cold in the way it gets cold when the sun goes, and the temperature drops 15 degrees in 20 minutes, and she pulled her cardigan closed. The cardigan with the loose button. She had never fixed it. She stopped on the shoulder of Route 66 and looked at the button and thought about fixing it and thought about the paperback with 40 pages left that she'd finished 2 weeks ago and the new one Ruthie had brought from the library. And she thought about the morning she'd sat on the bench and dialed the number on the back of a $20 bill. She thought about Arlo. She thought about him the way she thought about him every day. Not as an absence, which was how she'd thought about him for 30 years, but as a presence. As someone who had written her letters from a desert 8,000 miles away and told her the truth about the men he served with. As someone who had spent his last 7 minutes not on himself. As someone who had chosen well. She walked the rest of the way home in the dark. The courthouse in Flagstaff was a beige building that took its architecture seriously, and its ornamentation not at all which Eleanor had always thought was the right attitude for a building whose job was to tell the truth. Aldridge had driven her across town to it that morning, the car he'd borrowed from Hatch serving the purpose Eleanor's broken-down vehicle could not, and Colt had ridden alongside. The courtroom filled slowly. Several locals, Aldridge and a deputy in the row behind Eleanor. Ruthie, who had asked if she could come and been told yes. Rex and Hatch in the back on principle. Colt sat beside Eleanor. He had not made conversation on the drive over, which was correct. Some mornings are not for conversation. The proceedings began at 9. Declan Caldwell stood before the judge in clean clothes. He had been in county for 6 weeks. He was thinner. He was sober, she could tell from across the room, in the way sobriety clarifies a face, removes the layer between the person and the world. The judge was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses and a manner that said she had heard most things twice and was not easily surprised. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "the nature of what occurred on October 21st is not in dispute, and the pattern of behavior preceding it is well documented. I've also read Mrs. Hartwell's victim impact statement, your letters of remorse, and your supervising counselor's assessment." She looked over her glasses. "Tell me what you've understood." Declan stood straight. "I understood that I had choices and told myself I didn't," he said. "I understood that the person I was hurting had done nothing to deserve it, and I told myself it wasn't personal. Both were lies, I told myself, because the truth was harder. The truth is that I was given a way out of a problem, and I took it without asking what it cost the person in the way of it. And the cost was someone who'd given 25 years of good faith and earned the right to stay on that land, and I tried to scare her out because I was scared myself." The courtroom was quiet in the way courtrooms get when something true has been said in them. "I can't give Mrs. Hartwell back what I took from her," Declan said, "but I can do what she told me to do. Earn the rest." The judge looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Hartwell, You've recommended leniency within the framework of accountability. I want to give you the opportunity to add anything you'd like on the record. Eleanor stood. She had not prepared remarks. She had thought about this moment on the drive over and on the mornings in between and on the nights when she'd lain in the trailer with the lease in the nightstand drawer. Your Honor, she said, I've been serving coffee in this town for 40 years. In 40 years, I've watched a great many people at their worst and their best and all the points in between. The worst and the best are not always different people. Sometimes they're the same person on different days. She did not look at Declan while she said it. She didn't look away from him either. What happened to me was wrong. I want that on the record without qualification. And what I want, which I also want on the record, is for that young man to have the same opportunity I've had. The opportunity to decide every morning to be better than the morning before. That opportunity requires him to be somewhere he can use it. She sat down. She heard Colt exhale beside her. The judge sentenced Declan to 18 months in county with credit for the 6 weeks served and eligibility for work release after 4 months contingent on good behavior and continued counseling. 5 years probation. 500 hours community service. She did not apologize for any of it. Before the deputy was moved to collect him, Declan turned and looked at Eleanor. Mrs. Hartwell, thank you for what you said. Don't thank me, she said. Use it. He nodded. They began to lead him out. Eleanor was watching him go when the second thing happened. A man stood up from the last row. He was 45 years old and had his mother's coloring, her eyes in a face that was otherwise his father's. He wore a shirt that was clean and pressed in the careful way of someone who has relearned the habit recently and is holding on to it deliberately. He was thinner than he should have been. He stood with the posture of someone rebuilding something structural from the inside, not quite straight yet, but working on it. Eleanor had not seen Leland Hartwell in 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. She knew the count because she had been counting. Your Honor, he said, my name is Leland Hartwell. Eleanor Hartwell is my mother. I drove from Phoenix this morning to ask the court to consider her character in whatever way is still useful. She is the reason I am standing here in a clean shirt and not somewhere worse. She didn't give up on me even after I gave her every reason to. I've been trying to deserve that for 6 months, and I intend to keep trying for as long as it takes. He stopped. That's all he said, and sat down. Eleanor turned in her seat. She looked at her son. He was looking at his hands. Then he looked up and found her looking at him, and what happened to his face was too complicated and too old, and too much of it was hers as well for her to hold it at any distance. She stood up and walked to the back of the courtroom. Leland stood. She put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her, and neither of them said anything, because there was no sentence built yet adequate to 3 years and 6 months of sobriety, and a clean shirt, and a drive from Phoenix, and a courtroom in the middle of everything. She felt him shaking. She felt herself shaking. She held on. When she finally pulled back and looked at her son's face, she put one hand against his cheek, the way she had when he was small before all of it before the accident, and the years of watching someone she loved make choices she couldn't stop. You came, she said. He said I should have come sooner. She said, you came, that was the whole of it. The Eagle's Nest opened on a Saturday in the first week of June. Eleanor had not chosen the name quickly. She had sat with it through the winter months, through the court proceedings and their aftermath, and the slow administrative work of renaming a business that had been something else for 51 years. She had thought about what it meant to name something, which was to declare publicly what it was for. Rosie's had been named for a woman who died in 1989. The name had outlasted the person and become simply the place. Eleanor wanted the name to be the person. Eagle's Nest, she said to Colt one morning on the bench on a cold November day when the desert was brown and still. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something had found the room it needed inside him. He would have liked that, he said. I know, she said. The sign was hand-painted in dark letters on a pale background, clean and without ornament. Below the name in a different hand and smaller, in memory of Sergeant Arlo Eagle Reeves, USMC, 1964 to 1991. Below that on a separate piece of wood, where everybody's family. 200 people came on the June Saturday. More than Eleanor had anticipated, and exactly as many as the diner and its parking lot and the overflow into the adjacent lot could hold. Veterans in dress uniforms. Locals who had been coming since before the name changed, who had opinions about the renovation they expressed generously. 7 bikes in the parking lot polished to a state the desert would remedy by nightfall. Ruthie was there working. She had asked for a raise and received it and considered the matter settled. Leland was there behind the counter. He had come to Flagstaff 3 weeks after the courthouse and found a room on the north side and a job at a kitchen supply warehouse that didn't require him to explain the years only to show up, which he was doing. He was working the counter at the Eagle's Nest on Saturdays. He was not fast yet. He dropped things occasionally. Eleanor corrected him without ceremony and without cruelty, the way she corrected everything. Behind the grill working the morning rush with the steady focus of someone who has decided that every egg is a form of evidence was Declan Caldwell. He had been released from county the previous month, having served his sentence, with the months credited for the cooperation that had, among other things, contributed to the federal investigation of Victor Crane's operations across 4 states. He had come to Eleanor's door the week after his release in clean clothes, with his hands at his sides and a directness in his eyes that had not been there before. He said he understood if the answer was no. He was not there to ask for anything he hadn't earned, only to know if there was work. She made him coffee. She told him that a grill was not a pair of scissors, and that what happened at a grill was that you showed up and did the thing right until the thing right was simply what you did, and that she had specific opinions about eggs that she expected to be honored. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Don't call me ma'am," she said. "My name is Eleanor." He had been cooking for 6 weeks without missing a shift. He was getting faster. He did not call her ma'am. At 11 in the morning, when the initial rush had settled and the diner held the warm hum of a full Saturday and the smell of coffee and bacon had worked its way into every corner, Colt came behind the counter and stood beside Eleanor. He reached into the breast pocket of his cut. She knew what was in it before he took it out. He held the dog tags in his open palm between them. The chain was the one she recognized from the first morning at her counter by the metal worn at the edges in the way of something handled with care for a very long time. He had carried them since Kuwait, 33 years of carrying them through 217 wrong addresses, and the whole long work of trying to honor something made in 7 minutes in a desert 8,000 miles from here. Reeves Arlo J., the first tag read, 362-28-4401, POS USMC. Christian. She had not seen his full name on metal before. She had seen it in his handwriting on 40 letters. She had heard it in her own head every day for 33 years in her own voice. Seeing it stamped into metal was different. Colt said nothing. She reached out and took them from his palm. Lighter than she expected, the metal still carried the warmth of his body. She put them around her neck. They settled against her chest above the pocket where she kept his letters, which felt correct in the way that things feel correct when they have finally arrived where they were always meant to be. The weight was slight and specific, and she understood it would take time before she stopped noticing it was there, and then it would become part of her, the way the brakes had become part of her, the way the 40 years had become part of her. She left them outside her uniform where anyone could see. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." Colt picked up his coffee. He said, "Your brother chose right." She said, "So did he." She went back to work. The lunch rush built the way it always built on a Saturday, tables turning and refilling, the sound of conversation layering over the sound of the grill, and Ruthie calling orders, and Leland dropping a fork and picking it up again. Eleanor moved through it the way she had moved through it for 40 years, knowing the distance between every surface, the weight of every pot, the temperature of the coffee at 30 seconds and at 3 minutes. At 2 in the afternoon, when the lunch crowd was thinning, Eleanor took her 10-minute break for the first time that day. She went outside and sat on the bench to the left of the front door facing east. Colt came out a few minutes later and sat at the other end. They looked at Route 66 in the June light. The highway ran straight in both directions until the desert took it east toward nothing visible west, toward nothing visible, a line drawn through the landscape by people who needed to get somewhere and had chosen this particular way. 51 years of Rosie's Corner Diner had sat at this intersection, watching the traffic pass. The travelers and the truckers and the people who drove at midnight because midnight was the only hour they could tolerate. The diner had fed them and warmed them and given them coffee and sent them back onto the road. The sign above the door said something different now, but the coffee was the same. She had kept that. Colt said, "I've been thinking about what Rex brought up at the chapter meeting. The Veterans Fund." She said, "The Hawks Fund." He said, "The Hawks Fund." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought the Eagle's Nest might be the kind of place where veterans come for more than food." She looked at the highway. "Veterans eat free," she said. "First meal. That was always going to be the policy." He said, "I mean more than that. A place where they know someone sees them, knows what they carried, doesn't need them to explain it." She was quiet. She thought about the young Marine who had come into Rosie's 7 years ago and sat at the counter at 2 in the morning with his coffee going cold and his eyes very far away. She hadn't asked him to explain anything. She'd simply stayed near him, kept the coffee warm, and at 3:15 he had said, "I don't know how to be here anymore." She had said, "You're here right now. That's enough for right now." He'd come back 2 weeks later with someone from his unit and pointed at Eleanor and said, "This is who I told you about." She'd said, "Welcome. What can I get you?" "I know," she said to Colt. "That's what this place has always been for. I just wasn't doing it on purpose." "Maybe now you do it on purpose," he said. "Maybe now I do," she said. They sat for another few minutes. The afternoon sun was moving low and deliberate, the light on Route 66 going from white to gold in the slow shift that meant evening was making up its mind. Eleanor thought about Arlo's letters in her innermost pocket. She thought about the dog tags against her chest still warm. She thought about the paperback on her nightstand that she was 40 pages into and finding good. She thought about the button on her cardigan that she was going to fix this week. She had actually decided this time. She thought about Leland behind the counter moving carefully through the work of learning to be reliable again, dropping things and picking them up. She thought about 33 years and 217 wrong addresses and a woman who had changed her name and moved to a new city and made herself impossible to find, and a man who had kept looking anyway. And the morning she had sat on this bench and dialed the number on the back of a $20 bill because she'd run out of reasons not to. She thought about Arlo's last line. "You've been taking care of yourself your whole life, and you're better at it than anyone I know. But you don't have to do it alone." She had read that line so many times the paper had gone soft as cloth. She had understood it, she thought, in the way you understand things before you fully understand them, knowing the words without knowing their weight. The weight had arrived this year in pieces in a courtroom, in a parking lot, and a bench outside a diner at 5 in the morning when the desert was dark and the coffee was hot, and a man on a Harley was 2 streets over, keeping a promise nobody had asked him to keep. She stood up. She had tables to set for the dinner service, a son learning to balance plates, a diner named after her brother, a cardigan button to fix, a book to finish, and more ahead of her than she had let herself count on. Colt said, "Eleanor." She turned. He said, "Your brother would have liked today." She looked at the sign above the door. The dark paint on the pale background clean and saying exactly what she'd meant it to say. She said, "I know." She went inside. Colt sat on the bench a while longer. He sat the way he sometimes sat on his bike, giving himself permission to be still, and he watched the afternoon traffic on Route 66, the trucks and the travelers, and the people going somewhere specific, and the people who were just going. He reached into his jacket and touched the outside of his chest pocket where there was nothing anymore. The weight of the dog tags gone from where he'd carried them for 33 years. He did not feel the absence the way he'd expected to. He felt the specific relief of something returned to where it belonged. He finished his coffee and went inside. The bell above the door rang the same bell that had rung above that door for 51 years, marking arrivals and departures, the comings and goings of everyone who had passed through this corner of Route 66 and found something here needed or unexpected or both. The door closed. The afternoon went on. Route 66 ran flat and straight through the high desert in both directions, east and west, under a sky going from blue to the first suggestion of what the evening would become. The highway had been here before the diner and would be here after. It had watched things come and go for long enough to understand that the things that lasted were not always the things that looked permanent. Sometimes they were the things that simply kept showing up day after day in the same place doing the same work until showing up itself became the fact of them. The sign above the door caught the last light of the afternoon. Eagle's Nest. We're everybody's family. For those of you who held something together alone for longer than anyone should have to, does any of this sound familiar?